For decades, Pontiac was the loudest voice at General Motors. The GTO, the Firebird, the Trans Am. These weren't just cars, they were attitude, speed, rebellion, and a certain kind of American confidence. In 1964, the GTO helped invent something new, the muscle car. But excitement was never the problem. The problem was the company around it. Then came 2009. In April of that year, GM announced that Pontiac would be wound down, not sold, not spun off, closed. From 1926 to 2010. 84 years. How do you shut down the brand that made your company feel alive? Not with one decision, with 40 years of them. This is the rise and the fall of Pontiac. This isn't a list of cool cars. It's an autopsy. How a brand that defined American performance got switched off by the company that owned it. Pontiac didn't die because people stopped loving it. They never did. It died because of what GM did to it, slowly, over decades. And then one decision in 2009 that put it in writing. On American Ruin, we take apart how great American names fall. Not the splashy collapses you already know, the slow ones. The brands that got loved to the end and erased anyway. This one falls harder than most. To understand why GM let it die, you have to go back to why Pontiac was so alive in the first place. Back to 1926, when it wasn't even supposed to be the star. When it was, on paper, a backup plan. Start in 1909. General Motors buys a small company, the Oakland Motor Car Company, out of a town in Michigan named Pontiac. For years, Oakland is just another GM nameplate. Solid. Forgettable. The kind of car you bought because it ran, not because it made your heart beat faster. To understand what GM did next, you have to understand the problem it was trying to solve. In the 1920s, the company had a famous idea. A car for every purse and purpose. A ladder of brands, from cheap to luxury, so a buyer could start at the bottom and climb without ever leaving General Motors. Chevrolet at the floor, Cadillac at the top, a row of names in between. But there were gaps in that ladder, big price jumps between rungs. And a gap is just a place where a customer can wander off to a rival. So GM invented something to plug the gaps. They called it a companion make. The idea was simple. Take an existing division and give it a cheaper little sibling. Shared parts, same showrooms, aimed a notch lower on price. Fill the gap without building a whole new company from scratch. In 1926, GM launches the first of them. A brand new make called Pontiac, named for the same town as Oakland, sold right alongside it on the same floor. The plan was to slot it between Chevrolet at the bottom and Oakland just above it. Give buyers a quality 6-cylinder car at a price closer to a cheap 4. More car than you paid for. That was the whole pitch. And in 1920s America, where a car was the biggest thing most families would ever buy, it hit a nerve. And here's where it gets strange. Within months, Pontiac starts outselling Oakland. The companion outsells the host. Think about what that means. GM built Pontiac to be the sidekick, a supporting act for the older, more established brand. The whole point was to protect Oakland, not to replace it. And the sidekick walked out and stole the show in its first season. Why? Because buyers didn't care about badge history. They cared what they got for the money. A 6-cylinder engine in a car priced like a 4 was the deal of the showroom. Pontiac gave them more, and they voted with their wallets. It only got worse for the parent. Every year, more of those showroom dollars walked to the cheaper, newer name. Oakland faded, eaten alive by the car it was built to support. By 1931, GM did the math and made the call. They dropped Oakland. The original brand, the one Pontiac was built to support, was gone. And the companion took its place as a full General Motors division. The companion outsold the host. Within 5 years, the host was gone. That's the DNA worth remembering. From day one, Pontiac existed for one reason: to give you more than you paid for, to punch above its price. It didn't win on prestige, it won on value. For a long stretch, that's all it was, a value brand. Dependable cars, fair money, no drama. Through the Depression, through the war, through the long calm of the 1950s, Pontiac was the safe choice. The car your father bought because it was sensible, respectable, reliable, and honestly, a little boring. For about 30 years, nobody put a Pontiac poster on a bedroom wall. It was a good car. It was not an exciting one. And that's the thing about a brand built on value. Value keeps the lights on. But value alone never makes anyone fall in love. Then, one engineer looked at the rulebook and decided to break it. His name was John Z. DeLorean, Pontiac's chief engineer. Sharp, restless, allergic to the word no. To understand what he did, you have to understand a much older idea, one that lived in junkyards and back alley garages long before a showroom. The hot rodders idea. It went like this. If you want a car to be fast, you don't need a bigger budget. You need a bigger engine in a smaller car. Take a heavy V8 built for a big sedan, drop it into something lighter, and you get violence, acceleration that costs almost nothing extra, because the parts already exist on the shelf. For decades, that was a thing kids did in their driveways. No major automaker had built it that way and sold it off the factory floor. There was a reason for that. In the early 60s, GM had a rule on the books. No engines bigger than 330 cubic inches in its mid-size cars. Management wanted them sensible, affordable, slow. DeLorean and his team noticed something. The rule covered standard engines. It said nothing about optional ones. So they didn't break the rule. They walked straight through the gap in it. They took Pontiac's big 389 cubic inch V8, an engine built for heavy full-size cars, and offered it as an option on a mid-size Tempest, a light ordinary car you could already buy. Tick a box on the order sheet, and the factory would bolt a huge engine into it. Light car, huge engine, technically legal. The hot rodders trick, done by the people who built the car in the first place. They gave it a name borrowed from Ferrari. GTO, Gran Turismo Omologato, Italian racing language on a working-class Pontiac. A bit of a bluff, and it worked. 1964, the GTO arrives, and it's widely credited as the first true American muscle car. Now, enthusiasts will argue that point forever, and they're not wrong to. There were fast, big-engined cars before it. But the GTO is the one that put the whole formula in a showroom, at a price a young person could actually reach, and called it what it was. And that's why it landed like a shock. It was fast and affordable and a little bit outlaw. Built for a young buyer who didn't have Ferrari money but wanted Ferrari nerve. Pontiac expected to sell a few thousand. In the first year alone, they sold 32,450. And the rest of Detroit noticed immediately. Because here's what a hit does to an industry. It rewrites the rule book for everyone. Within a couple of years, every major American car maker was scrambling to answer the GTO. Big engines started dropping into mid-size bodies across the board. One engineer's loophole became an entire category, an arms race that defined American performance for the rest of the decade. Pontiac didn't just build a car, it started a war. And for a while, it was winning, and in that moment, Pontiac stopped being respectable. It became wanted. This is the turn. The boring value brand, the one built to give you more car for less money, found a second, far more dangerous identity. Speed, attitude, the car your parents didn't want you to have. That identity is everything. Hold on to it. Because that feeling, that swagger, the thing that made Pontiac matter, is the exact thing General Motors would spend the next several decades quietly erasing. But that's later. Right now, in the mid-60s, Pontiac has proven it can sell raw speed. The next question was bigger. Could it sell a feeling? Could it take that swagger off the street and put it on a movie screen and into a song? It was about to do both. 1967. Pontiac launches the Firebird. It arrives about 5 months after Chevrolet's Camaro, its own corporate cousin. Under the skin, they share a platform GM called the F-body. And this is the part that matters. This is GM doing the cost-saving thing. Two brands, one platform, but doing it right. Pontiac gave the Firebird its own face, its own engines, its own attitude. Same skeleton, different soul. And buyers could tell the difference instantly. Remember that. Because in a few years, GM forgets how to do this. It forgets that sharing the bones is fine, as long as you don't share the soul. Then, in 1969, the top of the line gets a name, the Trans Am, licensed from the SCCA's Trans Am Racing Series. The hottest, rarest Firebird you could buy. That first model year, Pontiac built just 697 of them. Almost nobody had one. Everybody wanted one. And that gap is exactly where a legend gets made. And then came the screen. 1977. Smokey and the Bandit. Burt Reynolds, a black and gold 77 Trans Am, and what's often called the most successful piece of automotive product placement anyone ever pulled off. Here's why that movie mattered. That car wasn't a prop in the background. It was a co-star. The chase wasn't the setup for the story. The car was the story. Reynolds drove it like a personality, and the camera loved it. And people walked out of the theater and into dealerships. Trans Am sales didn't climb. They exploded. A few years later, it happened again. 1982, Knight Rider, KITT, the black talking Trans Am with the red scanner sweeping across its nose. Same trick as the Bandit. The car wasn't a vehicle in the show. It was a character. It had a name. It had a voice. For a generation of kids watching after school, Pontiac wasn't a car company on a stock ticker. It was the coolest thing on television, and Pontiac knew exactly what it was selling. The tagline from the early 80s said it out loud. We build excitement. Sit with that for a second. It's a remarkable thing for a company to promise. Not reliability, not value, not transportation. Excitement, a feeling. A contract that said, this is not a tool, this is a thrill. And for a stretch of years, they actually delivered on it. This is the top of the mountain, the highest the brand would ever climb. On the screen, in the song, in the driveway, Pontiac wasn't selling metal. It was selling a feeling, a regular paycheck, a genuine piece of rebellion. That was the promise, fully kept, which raises an uncomfortable question. If it was this beloved, this iconic, this cool, how do you possibly kill it? You don't do it all at once. A brand this loved doesn't die from one bad decision. You do it slowly. You start by making it forget what it was. There's a term for what happened next. Badge engineering. In plain English, it works like this. You take one car, you design it once, you build it once. Then you sell it under 3 or 4 different division names, Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, changing almost nothing but the grille and the trunk badge. For an accountant, it's beautiful. One engineering bill spread across 4 brands. On a spreadsheet, it looks like free money. But for a brand built on identity, whose whole value is feeling different, it's poison. Slow poison. So picture it from the buyer's side. You loved Pontiac because it was different. The Firebird had its own soul, even though it shared bones with a Chevy. That was the whole reason you paid for the badge. Then, slowly, that difference vanishes. You walk into a showroom in the late 80s, into the 90s, and the Pontiac on the floors, you start to notice the same car your neighbor just bought wearing a different name. Same doors, same dashboard. You're not buying a Pontiac anymore. You're buying a generic GM car in a costume. And the buyer learns the quiet lesson. The badge doesn't mean anything special. So why pay for it? That's how an identity drains away. Not in a crash, but one model at a time. The brand stops being a promise and turns into a sticker. And here's the important part. There's no single villain in this. Nobody in a boardroom stood up and said, let's destroy Pontiac. It was math. The same cost-saving decision made over and over for 20 years. And each time, they spent a little more the one thing Pontiac actually owned. The thing the GTO built. The thing the Trans Am put on screen, its identity. And then there's the Aztek. On paper, the Aztek was supposed to be the comeback. Bold, different. A crossover before crossovers were everywhere. Pontiac getting ahead of a trend for once. The concept turned heads. Then the cost-cutting got hold of it. The same logic that had been hollowing out the brand for years went to work on the one car meant to save it. Corners shaved, shapes compromised. Squeezed through the parts bin until it barely resembled the concept. And what rolled out of the factory in 2001 became one of the most mocked cars ever built. A fixture on every ugliest cars in history list for the next 20 years. And the numbers tell the whole sad arc. The first full year, 2001, Pontiac sold about 21,000 Azteks, against a target of up to 75,000. It missed by a mile. Its best year barely reached 27,000. And by some accounts, nearly half of those went to rental fleets, not to people who chose it, to counters at the airport. By 2004, down to around 20,000. By 2005, about 5,000. And then it was gone. By 2005, one writer described Pontiac as little more than a dumping ground for rebadged products from the rest of GM. Read that again. The brand that invented the muscle car. A dumping ground? Now, you'll hear people say, the Aztek is the car that killed Pontiac. It's a good line. It's clean, it's funny. It's also not quite true. The Aztek wasn't the cause. It was the symptom. A warning light on the dashboard of a brand that had been hollowed out for 2 decades before it ever showed up. The real damage was already done, quietly. Badge by badge, year by year. By the time the Aztek rolled out, Pontiac had already stopped being Pontiac. The Aztek didn't kill it. It just put an ugly public face on a decline that had been running in the dark for years. And here's the cruel part. A hollowed-out brand can limp along for years, coasting on a name that used to mean something. As long as the company behind it stays standing, it can survive being hollow. What it can't survive is the company behind it running out of money. In 2008, the company ran out of money. 2008. The financial crisis hits, and it hits the car business like a wrecking ball. Here's the mechanism, because it matters. Almost nobody buys a car with cash. They borrow. The whole industry runs on credit. The buyer's loan, the dealer's financing, the manufacturer's own debt. And in 2008, credit froze. The loan stopped. Overnight, the customer who would have driven off the lot couldn't get the money to do it. Sales didn't slow down. They fell off a cliff. And a car maker with factories running and nobody buying burns cash at a terrifying speed. General Motors, one of the largest automakers in the world, started burning through cash it did not have. This is no longer a story about one brand. Pontiac is a footnote now. The real question is whether the giant that owned it survives the year. When GM finally laid its books on the table, it reported roughly $82 billion in assets, against roughly $173 billion in debt. Sit with those two numbers. More than twice as much owed as owned. That's not a rough quarter. That's a company that has driven off the end of the road. It would become one of the largest bankruptcies in American history. At that scale, a company doesn't just quietly fold. GM employed hundreds of thousands of people, directly and through its suppliers and dealers. Letting it collapse risked taking a huge chunk of the American economy down with it. So the federal government stepped in, a restructuring backed by the U.S. Treasury. Around $33 billion in emergency financing, money to keep the doors open, while they worked out what GM would even be on the other side of this. But that money came with a message, and the message was brutal and simple. To survive, GM had to get smaller, fast, and you cannot get smaller while carrying 8 separate car brands. June 1st, 2009. General Motors files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in New York. One of the cornerstones of the American century, in a courtroom, restructuring just to stay alive. A company fighting for its life can't afford 8 brands. The math is cruel, but it isn't complicated. Each brand is its own engineering budget, its own marketing, its own dealer network. Something has to go. And by then, everyone watching already knew which brand was most exposed. The one that had spent 20 years losing the thing that made it special. The one that, by its own numbers, had already stopped being itself. But here's the part most tellings get wrong. The decision about Pontiac wasn't made on June 1st in that courtroom. That's the date everyone remembers, the dramatic one, the one in the history books. But it had already been made. The decision came earlier, 5 weeks earlier. To find the moment Pontiac was actually sentenced, flip the calendar back, past the courtroom, past the headlines, to a quieter day in April. April 27th, 2009. More than a month before the bankruptcy filing, GM announces what it's going to do with Pontiac. The brand will be phased out, wound down by the end of 2010. Not sold, not spun off. Closed. Say it the way it actually landed. No buyer riding in to save it. No quiet sale to keep the name alive somewhere overseas. No spin-off, no rescue, no second life. The plan was to switch it off and let it end. For a brand that spent decades being the loudest thing in the room, it's a strangely quiet way to go. And a decision like that is never just a line in a press release. It lands on people. Think about who's on the other end of it. Start with the dealers. Families who'd sold Pontiacs for 30, 40 years, who'd built their whole business around that sign out front. Overnight, they were holding a franchise for a brand with an expiration date stamped on it. Then, the people who built them, the engineers who'd spent entire careers on these cars, the line workers, the mechanics who knew every bolt and every quirk. For them, this wasn't a strategy slide. It was a craft, a thing they were good at, ending, and the towns. Because a plant isn't just a building. It's the reason a diner across the street stays open. It's what pays the mortgages on streets full of families. And then the owners. The guy who bought his first GTO at 19 and never quite got over it. The kid who taped a Knight Rider poster to his wall and grew up to buy the real thing. For them, this wasn't a corporate restructuring. It was a small, private grief. The kind of loss that doesn't make the front page. It just quietly empties a parking lot. And then came the last one. The final Pontiac ever built was a G6. Sit with that for a second. Not a GTO. Not a Trans Am. Not a screaming black and gold legend. A sensible midsize sedan. The kind of car the brand had started out building 84 years earlier, before it ever learned how to be exciting. It was built at GM's Orion Assembly Plant in Orion Township, Michigan in January 2010. It rolled off a line that had built Pontiacs for years. The workers there knew what it was. Then that line went quiet and went on to build something else. By the end of 2010, the brand was gone. The signs came down. So let's be precise about what actually killed it. Because the easy answer is that the 2009 bankruptcy ended Pontiac is wrong. It's the wrong date for the wrong reason. GM didn't kill Pontiac in 2009. 2009 is just when it signed the certificate. The brand had been dying for a long time before that. It started dying in the badge engineering years. The day GM decided that the cheapest way to build a Pontiac was to stop building a Pontiac at all. The bankruptcy didn't cause the death. It just made it official. By 2009, there wasn't much left to save. The brand had been quietly emptied out for 20 years. The crisis simply gave GM a reason to finally admit it. The last G6 went quiet on the line. But the thing Pontiac actually built, that idea, that feeling, that didn't disappear with it. It just went looking for a new home. So what actually died on that assembly line in 2010? Not just a logo, not just a name on a trunk lid. What died was an idea, a genuinely democratic one when you think about it. That a regular, affordable American brand could sell you attitude. That a kid with a normal paycheck could walk onto a showroom floor and drive off with a real piece of rebellion. Not a luxury car, not a European exotic, a Pontiac. Excitement. Priced for everybody. That was the thing the GTO invented and the Trans Am made famous. Performance for the working man. And when Pontiac went, that promise went a little quiet. But the hunger for it didn't. And you can see exactly where it went. Look at the cars that filled the hole. Dodge leaning hard into its Hellcat-era muscle nostalgia, selling rage and horsepower to people who grew up wanting it. The Mustang surviving everything, carrying the torch. The Camaro, living its own on-again, off-again life, dying and coming back, because people kept asking for it. The market still wants the exact feeling Pontiac was built to sell. That craving never went anywhere. It just had to find a new badge to live under, which is the clearest proof of what was actually lost. And here's the lesson, if there is one. Stated plainly. Not as a secret, not as a scandal. Just what the record shows. GM didn't lose Pontiac to a bad market. The market still wanted what Pontiac made. GM lost Pontiac to itself by treating an identity like a line on a spreadsheet for 20 years, then cutting it when the bill finally came due. Because here's the thing the spreadsheet never captured. People don't get nostalgic about cost savings. Nobody puts a parts bin memo on their bedroom wall. They get nostalgic about the GTO, the black and gold Trans Am, the rumble at the stoplight, the car that felt like getting away with something, being 19 with the windows down. That's the part GM couldn't rebadge. The feeling. You can copy a chassis, you cannot copy a soul. And once it was gone for good. 1926 to 2010. 84 years. From the companion that outsold its own parent, to the brand that built the muscle car, to a name General Motors decided it could no longer afford to keep alive. Pontiac was the first American name we're taking apart on this channel. It won't be the last. Because Pontiac wasn't alone. There's a whole graveyard of great American brands that GM, Ford, and Chrysler switched off, sold off, or quietly let fade out. Names that meant something once, gone the same slow way. Oldsmobile, Saturn, Plymouth, Mercury, AMC. Every one of them has a story just like this one. A beginning, a golden hour, and a quiet corporate end. So you tell us, which one do you want us to dig up next? Drop the name in the comments. The most asked brand gets the next file. This is American Ruin. We'll see you at the next one.